War and Peace, Book 3, Chapter 6, read for LibriVox.org by Mark O'Neill. It was long since the Rostovs had news of Nicholas. Not till midwinter was the Count at last handed a letter, addressed in his son's handwriting. On receiving it, he ran on tiptoe to his study in alarm and haste, trying to escape notice, closed the door, and began to read the letter. Anna Mikhailovna, who always knew everything that passed in the house, on hearing of the arrival of the letter, went softly into the room, and found the Count with it in his hand, sobbing and laughing at the same time. Anna Mikhailovna, though her circumstances had improved, was still living with the Rostovs. "My dear friend," said she, in a tone of pathetic inquiry, prepared to sympathize in any way. The Count sobbed yet more. "Nikolenka, a letter, was wounded. My darling boy. The Countess, promoted to be an officer. Thank God. How tell the little Countess?" Anna Mikhailovna sat down beside him, with her own handkerchief, wiped the tears from his eyes and from the letter. Then, having dried her own eyes, she comforted the Count, and decided that at dinner and until tea time she would prepare the Countess, and after tea, with God's help, would inform her. At dinner, Anna Mikhailovna talked the whole time about the war news, and about Nikolenka, twice asked when the last letter had been received from him, although she knew that already, and remarked that they might very likely be getting a letter from him that very day. Each time that these hints began to make the Countess anxious, and she glanced uneasily at the Count and at Anna Mikhailovna. The latter very adroitly turned the conversation to insignificant matters. Natasha, who of the whole family was the most gifted, with the capacity to feel any shades of intonation, look, and expression, pricked up her ears from the beginning of the meal, and was certain that there was some secret between her father and Anna Mikhailovna, that it had something to do with her brother, and that Anna Mikhailovna was preparing them for it. Bold as she was, Natasha, who knew how sensitive her mother was to anything relating to Nikolenka, did not venture to ask any questions at dinner, but she was too excited to eat anything, and kept wriggling about on her chair, regardless of her governess's remarks. After dinner, she rushed headlong after Anna Mikhailovna, and, dashing at her, flung herself on her neck as soon as she overtook her in the sitting-room. "Auntie, darling, do tell me what it is." "Nothing, my dear." "No, dearest, sweet one, honey, I won't give up. I know you know something." Anna Mikhailovna shook her head. "You're a little slyboot," she said. "A letter from Nikolenka, I'm sure of it," exclaimed Natasha, reading confirmation in Anna Mikhailovna's face. "But for God's sake be careful, you know how it may affect your mamma." I will, only tell me." "You won't? Then I will go and tell at once." Anna Mikhailovna, in a few words, told her the contents of the letter, on condition she should tell no one. "No, on my true word of honour," said Natasha, crossing herself, "I won't tell anyone," and she ran off at once to Sonia. "Nikolenka, wounded! A letter!" she announced in gleeful triumph. "Nicholas," was all Sonia said, instantly turning white. Natasha, seeing the impression her brother's wound produced on Sonia, felt for the first time the sorrowful side of the news. She rushed to Sonia, hugged her, and began to cry. "A little wound, but he has been made an officer. He is well now, he wrote himself," said she through her tears. "There now, it's true that all you women are cry-babies," remarked Petya, pacing the room with large, resolute strides. "Now I'm very glad indeed, that my brother has distinguished himself so. You're all blubberers and understand nothing." Natasha smiled through her tears. "You haven't read the letter?" asked Sonia. "No, but she said it was all over and that he's now an officer." "Thank God," said Sonia, crossing herself. "But perhaps she deceived you. Let us go to Mamma." Petya paced the room in silence for a time. "If I had been in Nikolenka's place, I would have killed even more of those Frenchmen," he said. "What nasty brutes they are! I'd have killed so many that there'd been a heap of them." "Hold your tongue, Petya. What a goose you are!" "I'm not a goose, but they are who cry about trifles," said Petya. "Do you remember him?" Natasha suddenly asked after a moment's silence. Sonia smiled. "Do I remember Nicholas?" "No, Sonia, but do you remember so that you remember him perfectly? Remember everything," said Natasha, with an expressive gesture, evidently wishing to give her words a very definite meaning. "I remember Nikolenka too. I remember him well," she said, "but I don't remember Boris. I don't remember him a bit." "What, you don't remember Boris?" asked Sonia in surprise. "It's not that I don't remember. I know what he is like, but not as I remember Nikolenka. Him I just shut my eyes and remember, but Boris, no." She shut her eyes. "No, there's nothing at all." "Oh, Natasha," said Sonia, looking ecstatically and earnestly at her friend, as if she did not consider her worthy to hear what she meant to say, and as if she was saying it to someone else, with whom joking was out of the question. "I am in love with your brother once and for all, and whatever may happen to him or to me, shall never cease to love him as long as I live." Natasha looked at Sonia with wondering and inquisitive eyes, and said nothing. She felt that Sonia was speaking the truth, that there was such love as Sonia was speaking of, but Natasha had not yet felt anything like it. She believed it could be, but did not understand it. "Shall you write to him?" she asked. Sonia became thoughtful. The question of how to write to Nicholas, and whether she ought to write, tormented her. Now that he was already an officer and a wounded hero, would it be right to remind him of herself, and, as it might seem, of the obligations to her he had taken on himself? "I don't know. I think if he writes, I will write too," she said, blushing. "And you won't feel ashamed to write to him?" Sonia smiled. "No." "And I should be ashamed to write to Boris. I'm not going to." "Why should you be ashamed?" "Well, I don't know. It's awkward and would make me ashamed." "And I know why she'd be ashamed," said Petya, offended by Natasha's previous remark. "It's because she was in love with that fat one in spectacles." That was how Petya described his namesake, the new Count Bezúkhov. "And now she's in love with that singer." He meant Natasha's Italian singing master. "That's why she's ashamed." "Petya, you're stupid," said Natasha. "Not more stupid than you, madame," said the 9-year-old Petya, with the air of an old brigadier. The Countess had been prepared by Anna Mikhailovna's hints at dinner. On retiring to her own room, she sat in an armchair, her eyes fixed on a miniature portrait of her son on the lid of a snuff-box, while the tears kept coming into her eyes. Anna Mikhailovna, with the letter, came on tiptoe to the Countess's door and paused. "Don't come in," she said to the old Count, who was following her. "Come later." And she went in, closing the door behind her. The Count put his ear to the keyhole and listened. At first he heard the sound of indifferent voices, then Anna Mikhailovna's voice alone in a long speech, then a cry, then silence, then both voices together with glad intonations, and then footsteps. Anna Mikhailovna opened the door. Her face wore the proud expression of a surgeon who had just performed a difficult operation and admits the public to appreciate his skill. "It is done," she said to the Count, pointing triumphantly to the Countess, who sat holding in one hand the snuff-box with its portrait and in the other the letter, and pressing them alternately to her lips. When she saw the Count, she stretched out her arms to him, embraced his bald head, over which she again looked at the letter and the portrait, and in order to press them again to her lips, she slightly pushed away the bald head. Vera, Natasha, Sonia, and Petya now entered the room, and the reading of the letter began. After a brief description of the campaign and the 2 battles in which he had taken part, and his promotion, Nicholas said that he kissed his father and mother's hands, asking for their blessing, and that he kissed Vera, Natasha, and Petya. Besides that, he sent greetings to Monsieur Schelling, Madame Schloss, and his old nurse, and asked them to kiss for him dear Sonia, whom he loved and thought of just the same as ever. When she heard this, Sonia blushed so that tears came into her eyes, and, unable to bear the looks turned upon her, ran away into the dancing hall, whirled round it at full speed with her dress puffed out like a balloon, and, flushed and smiling, plumped down on the floor. The Countess was crying. "Why are you crying, mamma?" asked Vera. "From all he says, one should be glad and not cry." This was quite true, but the Count, the Countess, and Natasha looked at her reproachfully. And who is it she takes after, thought the Countess. Nicholas's letter was read over hundreds of times, and those who were considered worthy to hear it had come to the Countess, for she did not let it out of her hands. The tutors came, and the nurses, and Dmitri, and several acquaintances, and the Countess re-read the letter each time with fresh pleasure, and each time discovered in it fresh proofs of Nikolenka's virtues. How strange, how extraordinary, how joyful it seemed that her son, the scarcely perceptible motion of whose tiny limbs she had felt 20 years ago within her, that son about whom she used to have quarrels with the too indulgent Count, that son who had first learned to say Père and then Granny, that this son should now be away in a foreign land, amid strange surroundings, a manly warrior doing some kind of man's work of his own, without help or guidance. The universal experience of ages, showing that children do grow imperceptibly from the cradle to manhood, did not exist for the Countess. Her son's growth towards manhood, at each of its stages, has seemed as extraordinary to her, as if there had never existed the millions of human beings who grew up in the same way. As 20 years before, it seemed impossible that the little creature who lived somewhere under her heart would ever cry, suck her breast, and begin to speak, so that now she could not believe that that little creature could be this strong, brave man, this model son and officer, that, judging by this letter, he now was. "What a style! How charmingly he describes," said she, reading the descriptive part of the letter. "And what a soul! Not a word about himself, not a word. About some Denisov or other, though he himself, I dare say, is braver than any of them. He says nothing about his sufferings. What a heart! How like him it is, and how he has remembered everybody, not forgetting anyone. I always said, when he was only so high, I always said." For more than a week preparations were being made. Rough drafts of letters to Nicholas from all the household were written and copied out, while under the supervision of the Countess and the solicitude of the Count, money and all things necessary for the uniform and equipment of the newly commissioned officer were collected. Anna Mikhailovna, practical woman that she was, had even managed by favour with army authorities to secure advantageous means of communication for herself and her son. She had opportunities of sending her letters to the Grand Duke Constantine Pavlovich, who commanded the guards. The Rostovs supposed that the Russian guards abroad was quite a definite address, and that if a letter reached the Grand Duke in command of the guards, there was no reason why it should not reach the Pavlovgrad regiment, which was presumably somewhere in the same neighbourhood. And so it was decided to send the letters and money by the Grand Duke's courier to Boris, and Boris was to forward them to Nicholas. The letters were from the old Count, the Countess, Petya, Vera, Natasha, and Sonia, and finally there were 6,000 roubles for his outfit, and various other things the old Count sent to his son. End of chapter 6. Recording by Mark O'Neill, Würzburg, Germany. In Peace, Book 3, Chapter 7, read for LibriVox.org by Mark O'Neill. On the 12th of November, Kutuzov's active army, in camp before Olmütz, was preparing to be reviewed next day by the two emperors, the Russian and the Austrian. The guards, just arrived from Russia, spent the night 10 miles from Olmütz, and next morning were to come straight to the review, reaching the field at Olmütz by 10 o'clock. That day Nicholas Rostov received a letter from Boris, telling him that the Ismailov regiment was quartered for the night 10 miles from Olmütz, and that he wanted to see him as he had a letter and money for him. Rostov was particularly in need of money, now that the troops after their active service were stationed near Olmütz, and the camp swarmed with well-provisioned sutlers and Austrian Jews, offering all sorts of tempting wares. The Pavlovgrads held feast after feast, celebrating awards they had received for the campaign, and made expeditions to Olmütz to visit a certain Caroline the Hungarian, who had recently opened a restaurant there, with girls as waitresses. Rostov, who had just celebrated his promotion to a cornetcy and bought Denisov's horse, Bedouin, was in debt all round to his comrades and the sutlers. On receiving Boris's letter, he rode with a fellow officer to Olmütz, dined there, drank a bottle of wine, and then set off alone to the guards' camp to find his old playmate. Rostov had not yet had time to get his uniform. He had on a shabby cadet jacket, decorated with a soldier's cross, equally shabby cadet riding breeches, lined with worn leather, and an officer's sabre with a sword knot. The Don horse he was riding was one he had bought from a Cossack during the campaign, and he wore a crumpled hussar cap stuck jauntily back on one side of his head. As he rode up to the camp, he thought how he would impress Boris and all of his comrades of the Guards by his appearance, that of a fighting hussar who had been under fire. The Guards had made their whole march as if on a pleasure trip, parading their cleanliness and discipline. They had come by easy stages, their knapsacks conveyed on carts, and the Austrian authorities had provided excellent dinners for the officers at every halting place. The regiments had entered and left the town with their bands playing, and by the Grand Duke's orders the men had marched all the way in step, a practice on which the Guards prided themselves, the officers on foot and at their proper posts. Boris had been quartered and had marched all the way, with Berg, who was already in command of a company. Berg, who had obtained his captaincy during the campaign, had gained the confidence of his superiors by his promptitude and accuracy, and had arranged his money matters very satisfactorily. Boris, during the campaign, had made the acquaintance of many persons who might prove useful to him, and by a letter of recommendation he had brought from Pierre, had become acquainted with Prince Andrew Bolkonsky, through whom he hoped to obtain a post on the Commander-in-Chief's staff. Berg and Boris, having rested after yesterday's march, were sitting, clean and neatly dressed, at a round table in the clean quarters allotted to them, playing chess. Berg held a smoking pipe between his knees. Boris, in the accurate way characteristic of him, was building a little pyramid of chessmen with his delicate white fingers, while awaiting Berg's move, and watched his opponent's face, evidently thinking about the game, as he always thought, only of whatever he was engaged on. "Well, how are you going to get out of that?" he remarked. "We'll try to," replied Berg, touching a pawn and then removing his hand. At that moment the door opened. "Here he is at last!" shouted Rostov. "And Berg too! Oh, you Pettis fans! Allez coucher dormir!" he exclaimed, imitating his Russian nurse's French, at which he and Boris used to laugh long ago. "Dear me, how you have changed!" Boris rose to meet Rostov, but in doing so did not omit to steady and replace some chessmen that were falling. He was about to embrace his friends, but Nicholas avoided him. With that peculiar feeling of youth, that dread of beaten tracks, and wish to express itself in a manner different from that of its elders, which is often insincere, Nicholas wished to do something special on meeting his friend. He wanted to pinch him, push him, do anything but kiss him, a thing everybody did. But notwithstanding this, Boris embraced him in a quiet, friendly way and kissed him 3 times. They had not met for nearly half a year, and being at the age when young men take their first steps on life's road, each saw immense changes in the other, quite a new reflection of the society in which they had taken those first steps. Both had changed greatly since they last met, and both were in a hurry to show the changes that had taken place in them. "Oh, you damned dandies! Clean and fresh as if you'd been to a fete, not like us sinners of the line," cried Rostov, with martial swagger and with baritone notes in his voice, new to Boris, pointing to his own mud-bespattered breeches. The German landlady, hearing Rostov's loud voice, popped her head in at the door. "Eh, is she pretty?" he asked with a wink. "Why do you shout so? You'll frighten them," said Boris. "I did not expect you today," he added. "I only sent you the note yesterday by Bolkonsky, an adjutant of Kutuzov's, who's a friend of mine. I did not think he would get it to you so quickly." "Well, how are you? Been under fire already?" asked Boris. Without answering, Rostov took the soldier's cross of St. George, fastened to the cording of his uniform, and indicating a bandaged arm, glanced at Berg with a smile. "As you can see," he said. "Indeed, yes, yes," said Boris with a smile. "And we too have had a splendid march. You know, of course, that His Imperial Highness rode with our regiment all the time, so that we had every comfort and every advantage. What receptions we had in Poland! What dinners and balls! I can't tell you. And the Tsarevich was very gracious to all our officers." And the two friends told each other of their doings, the one of his hussar revels and life in the fighting line, the other of the pleasures and advantages of service under members of the imperial family. "Oh, you guard," said Rostov. "I say, send for some wine." Boris made a grimace. "If you really want it," said he. He went to his bed, drew a purse from under the clean pillow, and sent for wine. "Yes, and I have some money and a letter to give you," he added. Rostov took the letter, and throwing the money on the sofa, put both arms on the table and began to read. After reading a few lines, he glanced angrily at Berg, then, meeting his eyes, hid his face behind the letter. "Well, they've sent you a tidy sum," said Berg, eyeing the heavy purse that sank into the sofa. "As for us, Count, we get along on our pay. I can tell you for myself." "I say, Berg, my dear fellow," said Rostov, "when you get a letter from home, and meet one of your own people whom you want to talk everything over with, and I happen to be there, I'll go at once to be out of your way. Do go somewhere, anywhere, to the devil," he exclaimed. And immediately seizing him by the shoulder, and looking amiably into his face, evidently wishing to soften the rudeness of his words, he added, "Don't be hurt, my dear fellow. You know I speak from my heart, as to an old acquaintance." "Oh, don't mention it, Count. I quite understand," said Berg, getting up and speaking in a muffled and guttural voice. "Go across to our hosts. They invited you," added Boris. Berg put on the cleanest of coats, without a spot or speck of dust, stood before a looking-glass, and brushed the hair on his temples upwards, in the way affected by the Emperor Alexander, and having assured himself from the way Rostov looked at it that his coat had been noticed, left the room with a pleasant smile. "Oh dear, what a beast I am," muttered Rostov as he read the letter. "Why?" "Oh, what a pig I am not to have written, and to have given them such a fright. Oh, what a pig I am," he repeated, flushing suddenly. "Well, have you sent Gabriel for some wine? All right, let's have some." In the letter from his parents was enclosed a letter of recommendation to Bagration, which the old countess, at Anna Mikhailovna's advice, had obtained through an acquaintance, and sent to her son, asking him to take it to its destination and make use of it. "What nonsense! Much I need it," said Rostov, throwing the letter under the table. "Why have you thrown that away?" asked Boris. "It is some letter of recommendation. What the devil do I want it for?" "Why, what the devil," said Boris, picking it up and reading the address. "This letter would be of great use to you." "I want nothing, and I won't be anyone's adjutant." "Why not?" inquired Boris. "It's a lackey's job." "You're still the same dreamer, I see," remarked Boris, shaking his head. "And you're still the same diplomatist. But that's not the point. Come, how are you?" asked Rostov. "Well, as you see. So far everything's all right, but I confess I should much like to be an adjutant and not remain at the front. Why? Because when once a man starts on military service, he should try to make as successful a career of it as possible. Oh, that's it, said Rostov, evidently thinking of something else. He looked intently and inquiringly into his friend's eyes, evidently trying in vain to find the answer to some question. Old Gabriel brought in the wine. Should we now send for Berg? Asked Boris. He would drink with you. I can't. Well, send for him. And how do you get on with that German? Asked Rostov with a contemptuous smile. He's a very, very nice, honest and pleasant fellow, answered Boris. Again Rostov looked intently into Boris's eyes and sighed. Berg returned, and over the bottle of wine conversation between the three officers became animated. The guardsmen told Rostov of their march, and how they had made much of in Russia, Poland, and abroad. They spoke of the sayings and doings of their commander, the Grand Duke, and told stories of his kindness and irascibility. Berg, as usual, kept silent when the subject did not relate to himself, but in connection with the stories of the Grand Duke's quick temper, he related with gusto how in Galicia he had managed to deal with the Grand Duke when the latter made a tour of the regiments and was annoyed at the irregularity of a movement. With a pleasant smile, Berg related how the Grand Duke had ridden up to him in a violent passion, shouting, "Arnots!" Arnots was the Tsarevich's favourite expression when he was in a rage, and called for the company commander. Would you believe it, Count, I was not at all alarmed, because I knew I was right. Without boasting, you know, I may say that I know the army's orders by heart, and know the regulations as well as I do the Lord's Prayer. So, Count, there never is any negligence in my company, and so my conscience was at ease. I came forward. Berg stood up and showed how he presented himself, with his hand to his cap, and really it would have been difficult for a face to express greater respect and self-complacency than his did. Well, he stormed at me, as the saying is, stormed and stormed and stormed. It was not a matter of life, but rather of death, as the saying is. Albanians, and devils, and to Siberia, said Berg, with a sagacious smile. I knew I was in the right, so I kept silent. Was not that best, Count? Hey, are you dumb? He shouted. Still I remained silent. And what do you think, Count? The next day it was not even mentioned in the orders of the day. That's what keeping one's head means. That's the way, Count, said Berg, lighting his pipe and emitting rings of smoke. Yes, that was fine, said Rostov, smiling. But Boris noticed that he was preparing to make fun of Berg, and skilfully changed the subject. He asked him to tell them how and where he got his wound. This pleased Rostov, and he began talking about it, and as he went on, became more and more animated. He told them of his Schöngraben affair, just as those who have taken part in a battle generally do describe it. That is, as they would like it to have been, as they have heard it described by others, and it sounds well, but not at all as it really was. Rostov was a truthful young man, and would on no account have told a deliberate lie. He began his story meaning to tell everything just as it happened, but imperceptibly, involuntarily, and inevitably he lapsed into falsehood. If he had told the truth to his hearers, who like himself had often heard stories of attacks and had formed a definite idea of what an attack was, and were expecting to hear just such a story, they would either not have believed him, or, still worse, would have thought that Rostov was himself to blame, since what generally happens to the narrators of cavalry attacks had not happened to him. He could not tell them simply that everyone went at a trot, and that he fell off his horse and sprained his arm, and then ran as hard as he could from a Frenchman into the wood. Besides, to tell everything as it really happened, it would have been necessary to make an effort of will, to tell only what happened. It's very difficult to tell the truth, and young people are really capable of it. His hearers expected a story of how, beside himself and all aflame with excitement, he had flown like a storm at the square, cut his way in, slashed right and left, how his sabre had tasted flesh, and he had fallen exhausted, and so on. And so he told them all that. In the middle of his story, just as he was saying, "You cannot imagine what a strange frenzy one experiences during an attack," Prince Andrew, whom Boris was expecting, entered the room. Prince Andrew, who liked to help young men, was flattered by being asked for his assistance, and being well disposed towards Boris, who had managed to please him the day before, he wished to do what the young man wanted. Having been sent with papers from Kutuzov to the Tsarevich, he looked in on Boris, hoping to find him alone. When he came in and saw an hussar off the line recounting his military exploits, Prince Andrew could not endure that sort of man. He gave Boris a pleasant smile, frowned as with half-closed eyes he looked at Rostov, bowed slightly and wearily, and sat down languidly on the sofa. He felt it unpleasant to have dropped in on bad company. Rostov flushed up at noticing this, but he did not care. This was a mere stranger. Glancing, however, at Boris, he saw that he too seemed ashamed of the hussar off the line. In spite of Prince Andrew's disagreeable, ironical tone, in spite of the contempt with which Rostov, from his fighting army point of view, regarded all these little adjutants on the staff, of whom the newcomer was evidently one, Rostov felt confused, blushed, and became silent. Boris inquired what news there might be on the staff, and what, without indiscretion, one might ask about our plans. "We shall probably advance," replied Bolkowski, evidently reluctant to say more in the presence of a stranger. Berg took the opportunity to ask, with great politeness, whether, as was rumoured, the allowance of forage money to captains of companies would be doubled. To this Prince Andrew answered with a smile that he could give no opinion on such an important government order, and Berg laughed gaily. "As to your business," Prince Andrew continued, addressing Boris, "we will talk of it later." And he looked round at Rostov. "Come to me after the review, and we will do what is possible." And having glanced around the room, Prince Andrew turned to Rostov, whose state of unconquerable childish embarrassment, now changing to anger, he did not condescend to notice, and said, "I think you were talking of the Schön-Graben affair. Were you there?" "I was there," said Rostov angrily, as if intending to insult the aide-de-camp. Bolkowski noticed the hussar's state of mind, and it amused him. With a slightly contemptuous smile he said, "Yes, there are many stories now told about that affair." "Yes, stories," repeated Rostov loudly, looking with eyes suddenly grown furious, now at Boris, now at Bolkonsky. "Yes, many stories, but our stories are the stories of men who have been under the enemy's fire. Our stories have some weight, not like the stories of those fellows on the staff who get rewards without doing anything." "Of whom you imagine me to be one," said Prince Andrew, with a quiet and particularly amiable smile. A strange feeling of exasperation, and yet of respect for this man's self-possession, mingled at that moment in Rostov's soul. "I'm not talking about you," he said. "I don't know you, and frankly I don't want to. I'm speaking of the staff in general." "And I will tell you this," Prince Andrew interrupted in a tone of quiet authority. "You wish to insult me, and I am ready to agree with you that it would be very easy to do so if you haven't sufficient self-respect. But admit that the time and place are very badly chosen. In a day or two we shall all have to take part in a greater and more serious duel. And besides, Drubekovsky, who says he is an old friend of yours, is not at all to blame that my face has the misfortune to displease you. However," he added, rising, "you know my name and where to find me, but don't forget that I do not regard either myself or you as having been at all insulted, and as a man older than you, my advice is to let the matter drop. Well then, on Friday after the review I shall expect you. Drubetskovsky, au revoir," exclaimed Prince Andrew, and with a bow to them both he went out. Only when Prince Andrew was gone did Rostov think about what he ought to have said, and he was still more angry at having omitted to say it. He ordered his horse at once, and coldly taking leave of Boris, rode home. Should he go to headquarters next day and challenge that affected adjutant, or really let the matter drop, was the question that worried him all the way. He thought angrily of the pleasure he would have at seeing the fright of that small and frail but proud man when covered by his pistol, and then he felt with surprise that of all the men he knew there were none he would so much like to have for a friend as that very adjutant whom he so hated. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Mark O'Neill, Würzburg, Germany. Book 3, Chapter 8. Read for LibriVox.org by Mark O'Neill. The day after Rostov had been to see Boris, a review was held of the Austrian and Russian troops, both those freshly arrived from Russia and those who had been campaigning under Kutuzov. The two emperors, the Russian with his heir the Tsarevich, and the Austrian with the Archduke, inspected the Allied army of 80,000 men. From early morning, the smart, clean troops were on the move, forming up on the field before the fortress. Now thousands of feet and bayonets moved and halted at the officer's command, turned with banners flying, formed up at intervals and wheeled round other similar masses of infantry in different uniforms. Now was heard the rhythmic beat of hoofs and the jingling of showy cavalry in blue, red and green braided uniforms, with smartly dressed bandsmen in front, mounted on black, roan or grey horses. Then again, spreading out with the brazen clatter of the polished shining cannon that quivered on the gun carriages, and with the smell of linstocks, came the artillery, which crawled between the infantry and the cavalry and took up its appointed position. Not only the generals in full parade uniforms, with their thin or thick waists drawn into the utmost, their red necks squeezed into their stiff collars, and wearing scarves and all their decorations. Not only the elegant pomaded officers, but every soldier with his freshly washed and shaven face, and his weapons clean and polished to the utmost, and every horse groomed till its coat shone like satin, and every hair of its wetted mane lay smooth felt, that no small matter was happening, but an important and solemn affair. Every general and every soldier was conscious of his own insignificance, aware of being but a drop in that ocean of men, and yet at the same time was conscious of his strength as a part of that enormous whole. From early morning, strenuous activities and efforts had begun, and by 10 o'clock all had been brought into due order. The ranks were drawn up on the vast field. The whole army was extended in 3 lines, the cavalry in front, behind it the artillery, and behind that again the infantry. A space like a street was left between each 2 lines of troops. The 3 parts of that army were sharply distinguished. Kutuzov's fighting army, with the Pavlovgrads on the right flank of the front, those recently arrived from Russia, both guards and regiments of the line, and the Austrian troops, but they all stood in the same lines, under one command, and in a like order. Like wind over leaves ran an excited whisper. "They're coming! They're coming!" Alarmed voices were heard, and a stir of final preparation swept over all the troops. From the direction of Olmutz, in front of them, a group was seen approaching, and at that moment, though the day was still, a light gust of wind blowing over the army slightly stirred the streamers on the lances, and the unfolded standards fluttered against their staffs. It looked as if by that slight motion the army itself was expressing its joy at the approach of the emperors. One voice was heard shouting, "Eyes front!" Then, like the crowing of cocks at sunrise, this was repeated by others from various sides, and all became silent. In the death-like stillness, only the tramp of horses was heard. This was the emperor's suite. The emperors rode up to the flank, and the trumpets of the 1st Cavalry Regiment played the general march. It seemed as though not the trumpeters were playing, but as if the army itself, rejoicing at the emperor's approach, had naturally burst into music. Amid these sounds, only the youthful, kindly voice of the Emperor Alexander was clearly heard. He gave the words of greeting, and the 1st Regiment roared, "Hurrah!" so deafeningly, continuously, and joyfully, that the men themselves were awed by their multitude and the immensity of the power they constituted. Rostov, standing in the front lines of Kutuzov's army, which the Tsar approached first, experienced the same feeling as every other man in that army, a feeling of self-forgetfulness, a proud consciousness of might, and a passionate attraction to him who was the cause of this triumph. He felt that at a single word from that man all this vast mass, and he himself an insignificant atom in it, would go through fire and water, commit crime, die, or perform deeds of highest heroism, and so he could not but tremble, and his heart stand still at the imminence of that word. "Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!" thundered from all sides, one regiment after another greeting the Tsar with the strains of the march, and then "Hurrah!" Then the general march, and again "Hurrah! Hurrah!" growing ever stronger and fuller, and merging into a deafening roar. Till the Tsar reached it, each regiment in its silence and immobility seemed like a lifeless body, but as soon as he came up, it became alive, its thunder joining the roar of the whole line along which he had already passed. Through the terrible and deafening roar of those voices, amid the square masses of troops standing motionless as if turned to stone, hundreds of riders composing the suites moved carelessly but symmetrically, and above all freely, and in front of them two men, the emperors. Upon them the undivided, tensely passionate attention of that whole mass of men was concentrated. The handsome young Emperor Alexander, in the uniform of the Horse Guards, wearing a cocked hat with its peaks front and back, with his pleasant face and resonant though not loud voice, attracted everyone's attention. Rostov was not far from the trumpeters, and with his keen sight had recognized the Tsar and watched his approach. When he was within 20 paces, and Nicholas could clearly distinguish every detail of his handsome, happy young face, he experienced a feeling, tenderness, and ecstasy such as he had never before known. Every trait and every movement of the Tsar's seemed to him enchanting. Stopping in front of the Pavlograds, the Tsar said something in French to the Austrian Emperor and smiled. Seeing that smile, Rostov involuntarily smiled himself, and felt a still stronger flow of love for his sovereign. He longed to show that love in some way, and knowing that this was impossible, was ready to cry. The Tsar called the colonel of the regiment and said a few words to him. "Oh God, what would happen to me if the Emperor spoke to me?" thought Rostov. "I should die of happiness." The Tsar addressed the officers also. "I thank you all, gentlemen. I thank you with my whole heart." To Rostov every word sounded like a voice from heaven. How gladly would he have died at once for his Tsar. "You have earned St. George's standards, and will be worthy of them." Oh, to die for him, thought Rostov. The Tsar said something more which Rostov did not hear, and the soldiers, straining their lungs, shouted, "Hurrah!" Rostov too, bending over his saddle, shouted, "Hurrah!" with all his might, feeling that he would like to injure himself by that shout, if only to express his rapture fully. The Tsar stopped a few minutes in front of the hussars, as if undecided. How can the Emperor be undecided, thought Rostov, but then even this indecision appeared to him majestic and enchanting, like everything else the Tsar did. That hesitation lasted only an instant. The Tsar's foot, in the narrow pointed boot then fashionable, touched the groin of the bob-tailed bay mare he rode. His hand in a white glove gathered up the reins, and he moved off accompanied by an irregularly swaying sea of aides-de-camp. Farther and farther he rode away, stopping at other regiments, till at last only his white plumes were visible to Rostov from amid the suites that surrounded the emperors. Among the gentlemen of the suite, Rostov noticed Bolkonsky, sitting his horse indolently and carelessly. Rostov recalled their quarrel of yesterday, and the question presented itself whether he ought or ought not to challenge Bolkonsky. Of course not, he now thought. Is it worth thinking or speaking of it at such a moment? At a time of such love, such rapture, and such self-sacrifice, what do any of our quarrels and affronts matter? I love and forgive everybody now. When the Emperor had passed nearly all the regiments, the troops began a ceremonial march past him, and Rostov and Bedouin, recently purchased from Denisov, rode past too, at the rear of his squadron that is, alone and in full view of the Emperor. Before he reached him, Rostov, who was a splendid horseman, spurred Bedouin twice, and successfully put him to the showy trot in which the animal went when excited. Bending his foaming muzzle to his chest, his tail extended, Bedouin, as if also conscious of the Emperor's eye upon him, passed splendidly, lifting his feet with a high and graceful action, as if flying through the air without touching the ground. Rostov himself, his legs well back and his stomach drawn in, and feeling himself one with his horse, rode past the Emperor with a frowning but blissful face, like a viewy devil, as Denisov expressed it. Fine fellows, the Polovgras, remarked the Emperor. My God, how happy I should be if he ordered me to leap into the fire this instant, thought Rostov. When the review was over, the newly arrived officers, and also Kutuzovs, collected in groups and began to talk about the awards, about the Austrians and their uniforms, about their lines, about Bonaparte, and how badly the latter would fare now, especially if the Essen Corps arrived and Prussia took our side. But the talk in every group was chiefly about the Emperor Alexander. His every word and movement was described with ecstasy. They all had but one wish: to advance as soon as possible against the enemy under the Emperor's command. Commanded by the Emperor himself, they could not fail to vanquish anyone, be it whom it might. So thought Rostov and most of the officers after the review. All were then more confident of victory than the winning of 2 battles would have made them. End of chapter 8. Recording by Mark O'Neill, Würzburg, Germany. www.betterthan.therapy.net.
War and Peace, Book 3, Chapter 9. Recording for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. The day after the review, Boris, in his best uniform and with his comrade Berg's best wishes for success, rode to Olmütz to see Bolkonsky, wishing to profit by his friendliness and obtain for himself the best post he could, preferably that of an adjutant to some important personage, a position in the army which seemed to him most attractive. It is all very well for Rostov, whose father sends him 10,000 rubles at a time, to talk about not wishing to cringe to anybody and not be anyone's lackey, but I, who have nothing but my brains, have to make a career and must not miss opportunities but must avail myself of them, he reflected. He did not find Prince Andrew in Olmütz that day, but the appearance of the town where the headquarters and the diplomatic corps were stationed and the 2 emperors were living with their suites, households and courts only strengthened his desire to belong to that higher world. He knew no one, and despite his smart guardsman's uniform, all these exalted personages passing in the streets in their elegant carriages, with their plumes, ribbons and medals, both courtiers and military men, seemed so immeasurably above him, an insignificant officer of the Guards, that they not only did not wish to, but simply could not be aware of his existence. At the quarters of the commander-in-chief, Kutuzov, where he inquired for Bolkonsky, all the adjutants and even the orderlies looked at him as if they wished to impress on him that a great many officers like him were always coming there and that everybody was heartily sick of them. In spite of this, or rather because of it, next day, November 15, after dinner, he again went to Olmütz and, entering the house occupied by Kutuzov, asked for Bolkonsky. Prince Andrew was in, and Boris was shown into a large hall, probably formerly used for dancing, but in which 5 beds now stood, and furniture of various kinds, a table, chairs, and a clavichord. One adjutant nearest the door was sitting at the table in a Persian dressing gown, writing. Another, the red, stout Nesvitsky, lay on a bed with his arm under his head, laughing with an officer who had sat down beside him. A third was playing a Viennese waltz on the clavichord, while a fourth, lying on the clavichord, sang the tune. Bolkonsky was not there. None of these gentlemen changed his position on seeing Borís. The one who was writing and whom Borís addressed turned round crossly and told him Bolkonsky was on duty and that he should go through the door on the left into the reception room if he wished to see him. Borís thanked him and went to the reception room, where he found some 10 officers and generals. When he entered, Prince Andrew, his eyes drooping contemptuously with that peculiar expression of polite weariness which plainly says, "If it were not my duty, I would not talk to you for a moment," was listening to an old Russian general with decorations, who stood very erect, almost on tiptoe, with a soldier's obsequious expression on his purple face, reporting something. "Very well, then, be so good as to wait," said Prince Andrew to the general in Russian, speaking with the French intonation he affected when he wished to speak contemptuously, and, noticing Borís, Prince Andrew, paying no more heed to the general, who ran after him imploring him to hear something more, nodded and turned to him with a cheerful smile. At that moment Borís clearly realized what he had before surmised, that in the army, beside the subordination and discipline prescribed in the military code, which he and the others knew in the regiment, there was another, more important subordination, which made this tight-laced, purple-faced general wait respectfully while Captain Prince Andrew, for his own pleasure, chose to chat with Lieutenant Drubetskóy. More than ever was Borís resolved to serve in future not according to the written code, but under this unwritten law. He felt now that merely by having been recommended to Prince Andrew he had already risen above the general who at the front had the power to annihilate him, a lieutenant of the Guards. Prince Andrew came up to him and took his hand. "I am very sorry you didn't find me in yesterday. I was fussing about with Germans all day. We went with Weyrother to survey the dispositions. When Germans start being accurate, there is no end to it." Borís smiled as if he understood what Prince Andrew was alluding to as something generally known. But it was the first time he had heard Weyrother's name or even the term dispositions. "Well, my dear fellow, so you still want to be an adjutant? I have been thinking about you." "Yes, I was thinking," for some reason Borís could not help blushing, "of asking the commander-in-chief. He has had a letter from Prince Kurágin about me. I only wanted to ask because I fear the Guards won't be in action," he added as if in apology. All right, we'll talk it over," replied Prince Andrew. "Only let me report this gentleman's business and I shall be at your disposal." While Prince Andrew went to report about the purple-faced general, that gentleman, evidently not sharing Borís' conception of the advantages of the unwritten code of subordination, looked so fixedly at the presumptuous lieutenant who had prevented his finishing what he had to say to the adjutant, that Borís felt uncomfortable. He turned away and waited impatiently for Prince Andrew's return from the commander-in-chief's room. "You see, my dear fellow, I've been thinking about you," said Prince Andrew when they had gone into the large room where the clavichord was. "It's no use your going to the commander-in-chief. He would say a lot of pleasant things, ask you to dinner—" "That would not be bad as regards the unwritten code," thought Borís, "but nothing more would come of it. There will soon be a battalion of us aides-de-camp and adjutants. But this is what we will do. I have a good friend, an adjutant general and an excellent fellow, Prince Dolgorúkov, and though you may not know it, the fact is that now Kutúzov with his staff and all of us count for nothing. Everything is now centered round the Emperor. So we will go to Dolgorúkov. I have to go there anyhow, and I have already spoken to him about you. We shall see whether he cannot attach you to himself or find a place for you somewhere nearer the sun." Prince Andrew always became specially keen when he had to guide a young man and help him to worldly success. Under cover of obtaining help of this kind for another, which from pride he would never accept for himself, he kept in touch with the circle which confers success and which attracted him. He very readily took up Borís' cause and went with him to Dolgorúkov. It was late in the evening when they entered the palace at Olmütz, occupied by the emperors and their retinues. That same day a council of war had been held in which all the members of the Hofkriegsrath and both emperors took part. At that council, contrary to the views of the old generals Kutúzov and Prince Schwarzenberg, it had been decided to advance immediately and give battle to Bonaparte. The council of war was just over when Prince Andrew, accompanied by Borís, arrived at the palace to find Dolgorúkov. Everyone at headquarters was still under the spell of the day's council, at which the party of the young had triumphed. The voices of those who counseled delay and advised waiting for something else before advancing had been so completely silenced, and their arguments confuted by such conclusive evidence of the advantages of attacking, that what had been discussed at the council, the coming battle and the victory that would certainly result from it, no longer seemed to be in the future but in the past. All the advantages were on our side. Our enormous forces, undoubtedly superior to Napoleon's, were concentrated in one place. The troops, inspired by the Emperor's presence, were eager for action. The strategic position where the operations would take place was familiar in all its details to the Austrian General Weyrother. A lucky accident had ordained that the Austrian army should maneuver the previous year on the very fields where the French had now to be fought. The adjacent locality was known and shown in every detail on the maps, and Bonaparte, evidently weakened, was undertaking nothing. Dolgorúkov, one of the warmest advocates of an attack, had just returned from the council, tired and exhausted, but eager and proud of the victory that had been gained. Prince Andrew introduced his protégé, but Prince Dolgorúkov, politely and firmly pressing his hand, said nothing to Borís, and evidently unable to suppress the thoughts which were uppermost in his mind at that moment, addressed Prince Andrew in French. "Ah, my dear fellow, what a battle we have gained! God grant that the one that will result from it will be as victorious. However, dear fellow," he said abruptly and eagerly, I must confess to having been unjust to the Austrians, and especially to Weyrother. What exactitude, what minuteness, what knowledge of the locality, what foresight for every eventuality, every possibility, even to the smallest detail! No, my dear fellow, no conditions better than our present ones could have been devised. This combination of Austrian precision with Russian valor, what more could be wished for? "So the attack is definitely resolved on?" asked Bolkónski. "And you know, my dear fellow, it seems to me that Bonaparte had decidedly lost bearings. You know that a letter was received from him today for the Emperor." Dolgorúkov smiled significantly. "Is that so? And what did he say?" inquired Bolkónski. "What can he say? Tra diri dira and so on, merely to gain time." "I tell you he is in our hands, that is certain." "But what was most amusing," he continued with a sudden good-natured laugh, "was that we could not think how to address the reply. If not as consul, and of course not as Emperor, it seemed to me it should be to General Bonaparte. But between not recognizing him as Emperor and calling him General Bonaparte, there is a difference," remarked Bolkónski. "That is just it," interrupted Dolgorúkov, quickly laughing. "You know Bilíbin, he is a very clever fellow. He suggested addressing him as usurper and enemy of mankind." Dolgorúkov laughed merrily. "Only that?" said Bolkónski. "All the same, it was Bilíbin who found a suitable form for the address. He is a wise and clever fellow." "What was it?" "To the head of the French government, au chef du gouvernement français," said Dolgorúkov with grave satisfaction. "Good, wasn't it?" "Yes, but he will dislike it extremely," said Bolkónski. "Oh yes, very much. My brother knows him. He has dined with him, the present Emperor, more than once in Paris, and tells me he never met a more cunning or subtle diplomatist. You know, a combination of French adroitness and Italian play-acting. Do you know the tale about him and Count Markóv? Count Markóv was the only man who knew how to handle him. You know the story of the handkerchief? It is delightful." And the talkative Dolgorúkov, turning now to Borís, now to Prince Andrew, told how Bonaparte, wishing to test Markóv, our ambassador, purposely dropped the handkerchief in front of him and stood looking at Markóv, probably expecting Markóv to pick it up for him, and how Markóv immediately dropped his own beside it and picked it up without touching Bonaparte's. "Delightful," said Bolkónski. "But I have come to you, Prince, as a petitioner on behalf of this young man. You see..." But before Prince Andrew could finish, an aide-de-camp came in to summon Dolgorúkov to the Emperor. "Oh, what a nuisance!" said Dolgorúkov, getting up hurriedly and pressing the hands of Prince Andrew and Borís. "You know I should be very glad to do all in my power both for you and for this dear young man." Again he pressed the hand of the latter with an expression of good-natured, sincere, and animated levity. "But you see, another time..." Borís was excited by the thought of being so close to the higher powers as he felt himself to be at that moment. He was conscious that here he was in contact with the springs that set in motion the enormous movements of the mass of which, in his regiment, he felt himself a tiny, obedient, and insignificant atom. They followed Prince Dolgorukov out into the corridor and met, coming out of the door of the Emperor's room by which Dolgorukov had entered, a short man in civilian clothes, with a clever face and sharply projecting jaw, which, without spoiling his face, gave him a peculiar vivacity and shiftiness of expression. This short man nodded to Dolgorukov as an intimate friend and stared at Prince Andrew with cool intensity, walking straight toward him and evidently expecting him to bow or to step out of his way. Prince Andrew did neither. A look of animosity appeared on his face, and the other turned away and went down the side of the corridor. "Who was that?" asked Borís. "He is one of the most remarkable, but to me most unpleasant of men. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Prince Adam Czartoryski. It is such men as he who decide the fate of nations," added Bolkónski with a sigh he could not suppress as they passed out of the palace. Next day the army began its campaign, and up to the very battle of Austerlitz Borís was unable to see either Prince Andrew or Dolgorukov again, and remained for a while with the Ismáilov regiment. End of chapter 9. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
War and Peace, Book 3, Chapter 10, read for LibriVox.org by Mark O'Neill. At dawn on the 16th of November, Denísov's squadron, in which Nicholas Rostov served and which was in Prince Bagration's detachment, moved from the place where it had spent the night, advancing into action as arranged, and after going behind other columns for about 2/3 of a mile, was stopped on the high road. Rostov saw the Cossacks, and then the first and second squadrons of hussars and infantry battalions and artillery pass by and go forward, and then Generals Bagration and Dolgorukov ride past with the adjutants. All the fear before action which he had experienced as previously, all the inner struggle to conquer that fear, all his dreams of distinguishing himself as a true hussar in this battle, had been wasted. Their squadron remained in reserve, and Nicholas Rostov spent that day in a dull and wretched mood. At 9 in the morning he heard firing in front and shouts of hurrah, and saw wounded being brought back. There were not many of them, and at last he saw how a whole detachment of French cavalry was brought in, conveyed by a sontia of Cossacks. Evidently the affair was over, and though not big, had been a successful engagement. The men and officers returning spoke of a brilliant victory, of the occupation of the town of Wishaw, and the capture of a whole French squadron. The day was bright and sunny after a sharp night frost, and the cheerful glitter of that autumn day was in keeping with the news of victory which was conveyed, not only by the tales of those who had taken part in it, but also by the joyful expression on the faces of soldiers, officers, generals, and adjutants, as they passed Rostov going or coming. And Nicholas, who had vainly suffered all the dread that precedes a battle, and had spent that happy day in inactivity, was all the more depressed. "Come here, Rostov, let's drink to drown our grief," shouted Denísov, who had settled down by the roadside with a flask and some food. The officers gathered round Denísov's canteen, eating and talking. "There, they're bringing another," cried one of the officers, indicating a captive French dragoon who was being brought in on foot by 2 Cossacks. One of them was leading by the bridle a fine large French horse he had taken from the prisoner. "Sell us that horse," Denísov called out to the Cossacks. "If you like, your honour." The officers got up and stood round the Cossacks and their prisoner. The French dragoon was a young Alsatian, who spoke French with a German accent. He was breathless with agitation. His face was red, and when he heard some French spoken, he at once began speaking to the officers, addressing first one, then another. He said he would not have been taken, it was not his fault, but the corporals who had sent him to see some horse clothes, though he had told them the Russians were there, and at every word he added, "But don't hurt my little horse," and stroked the animal. It was plain that he did not quite grasp where he was. Now he excused himself for having been taken prisoner, and now, imagining himself before his own officers, insisted on his soldierly discipline and zeal in the service. He brought with him into our rearguard all the freshness of atmosphere of the French army, which was so alien to us. The Cossacks sold the horse for 2 gold pieces, and Rostov, being the richest of the officers, now that he had received his money, bought it. "But don't hurt my little horse," said the Alsatian good-naturedly to Rostov when the animal was handed over to the hussar. Rostov smilingly reassured the dragoon and gave him money. "Allez, allez," said the Cossack, touching the prisoner's arm to make him go on. The Emperor was suddenly heard among the hussars. All began to run and bustle, and Rostov saw coming up the road behind him several riders with white plumes in their hats. In a moment everyone was in his place waiting. Rostov did not know or remember how he ran to his place and mounted. Instantly his regret at not having been in action, and his dejected mood amid people of whom he was weary, had gone. Instantly every thought of himself had vanished. He was filled with happiness at his nearness to the Emperor. He felt that this nearness by itself made up to him for the day he had lost. He was happy as a lover when the longed-for moment of meeting arrives. Not daring to look round, and without looking round, he was ecstatically conscious of his approach. He felt it not only from the sound of the hoofs of the approaching cavalcade, but because as he drew near everything grew brighter, more joyful, more significant, and more festive around him. Nearer and nearer to Rostov came that sun, shedding beams of mild and majestic light around, and already he felt himself enveloped in those beams. He heard his voice, that kindly, calm, and majestic voice, that was yet so simple, and as if in accord with Rostov's feeling, there was a deathly stillness amid which was heard the Emperor's voice. "The Pavlograd Hussars?" he inquired. "The reserve, sire," replied a voice, a very human one compared to that which had said, "The Pavlograd Hussars?" The Emperor drew level with Rostov and halted. Alexander's face was even more beautiful than it had been 3 days before at the review. It shone with such gaiety and youth, such innocent youth, that it suggested the liveliness of a 14-year-old boy, and yet it was the face of the majestic Emperor. Casually, while surveying the squadron, the Emperor's eyes met Rostov's, and rested on them for not more than 2 seconds. Whether or not the Emperor understood what was going on in Rostov's soul, it seemed to Rostov that he understood everything. At any rate, his light blue eyes gazed for about 2 seconds into Rostov's face. A gentle, mild light poured from them. Then all at once he raised his eyebrows, abruptly touched his horse with his left foot, and galloped on. The young Emperor could not restrain his wish to be present at the battle, and in spite of the remonstrances of his courtiers, at 12 o'clock left the third column with which he had been, and galloped towards the vanguard. Before he came up with the hussars, several adjutants met him with news of the successful result of the action. This battle, which consisted in the capture of a French squadron, was represented as a brilliant victory over the French, and so the Emperor and the whole army, especially while the smoke hung over the battlefield, believed that the French had been defeated and were retreating against their will. A few minutes after the Emperor had passed, the Pavlograd division was ordered to advance. In Warsaw himself, a pretty German town, Rostov saw the Emperor again. In the market-place, where there had been some rather heavy fighting before the Emperor's arrival, lay several killed and wounded soldiers, whom there had not been time to move. The Emperor, surrounded by his suite of officers and courtiers, was riding a bobtailed chestnut mare, a different one from that which he had ridden at the review, and bending to one side he gracefully held a gold lorgnette to his eyes, and looked at a soldier who lay prone, with blood on his uncovered head. The wounded soldier was so dirty, coarse, and revolting, that his proximity to the Emperor shocked Rostov. Rostov saw how the Emperor's rather round shoulders shuddered, as if a cold shiver had run down them, how his left foot began convulsively tapping the horse's side with the spur, and how the well-trained horse looked round unconcerned and did not stir. An adjutant, dismounting, lifted the soldier under the arms to place him on a stretcher that had been brought. The soldier groaned. "Gently, gently. Can't you do it more gently?" said the Emperor, apparently suffering more than the dying soldier, and he rode away. Rostov saw tears filling the Emperor's eyes, and heard him, as he was riding away, saying to Czartoryski, "What a terrible thing war is! What a terrible thing! Quelle terrible chose que la guerre!" The troops of the vanguard were stationed before Wishaw, within sight of the enemy's lines, which all day long had yielded ground to us at the least firing. The Emperor's gratitude was announced to the vanguard, rewards were promised, and the men received a double ration of vodka. The campfires crackled, and the soldiers' songs resounded even more merrily than on the previous night. Denisov celebrated his promotion to the rank of major, and Rostov, who had already drunk enough at the end of the feast, proposed the Emperor's health. "Not our sovereign the Emperor, as they say at official dinners," said he, "but the health of our sovereign, that good, enchanting, and great man. Let us drink to his health, and to the certain defeat of the French." "If we fought before," he said, "not letting the French pass, as at Schöngraben, what shall we not do now when he is at the front? We will all die for him gladly. Is it not so, gentlemen? Perhaps I am not saying it right. I have drunk a great deal, but that is how I feel, and so do you too. To the health of Alexander I. Hurrah!" "Hurrah!" rang the enthusiastic voices of the officers. And the old cavalry captain, Kirsten, shouted enthusiastically, and no less sincerely than the 20-year-old Rostov. When the officers had emptied and smashed their glasses, Kirsten filled others, and in shirt sleeves and breeches went glass in hand to the soldiers' bonfires, and with his long grey moustache, his white chest showing under his open shirt, he stood in a majestic pose in the light of the campfire, waving his uplifted arm. "Lads, here's to our sovereign, the Emperor, in victory over our enemies. Hurrah!" he exclaimed, in his dashing old hussar's baritone. The hussars crowded round and responded heartily with loud shouts. Late that night, when all had separated, Denisov with his short hand patted his favourite, Rostov, on the shoulder. "As there's no one to fall in love with on campaign, he's fallen in love with the Tsar," he said. "Denisov, don't make fun of it," cried Rostov. "It is such a lofty, beautiful feeling, such a I believe it, friend, and I share and approve." "No, you don't understand." And Rostov got up and went wandering among the campfires, dreaming of what happiness it would be to die, not in saving the Emperor's life, he did not even dare to dream of that, but simply to die before his eyes. He really was in love with the Tsar, and the glory of the Russian arms, and the hope of future triumph. And he was not the only man to experience that feeling during those memorable days preceding the Battle of Austerlitz. 9/10 of the men in the Russian army were then in love, though less ecstatically, with their Tsar and the glory of the Russian arms. End of chapter 10. Recording by Mark O'Neill, Würzburg, Germany. www.betterthan